To win the fight against violent crime, detectives need evidence.
The injuries were incredible and they were never survivable.
From minute traces of DNA...
She would have fought for a knife, and that was the case because she scratched them.
...to the twisted remains of international terrorism.
Everything indicated that these people were not who they said they were.
I mean, we knew the eyes of the world was on us. I mean, there's nothing more motivating than that.
A thorough, detailed investigation takes time. When you're looking for clues at a crime scene, accuracy is everything.
We train, we instill into our detectives ATD, attention to detail.
That attention to every detail is probably one of the most critical attributes that you can have in a detective.
ATD, attention to detail, attention to detail.
It was the detail that would bring you success.
The walls were all punched in, the windows were all gone, parts of the house were found on the neighbours' properties. The house was insulated with a product called Insul Fluff, which is ground up newspaper, and it rained down over everything.
When Colin Matthews arrived at the site of the mystery explosion, he faced an horrific scene. One woman was dead, another seriously wounded.
Both victims, the deceased and the one that lived, had lost massive amounts of blood, which had poured all over the floor and got mixed up with all the Insul Fluff.
Finding any clue to the blast seemed an impossible task. For 3 days, the investigators just planned, with help from explosives experts.
It's obvious that there's a bomb gone off here. What are we looking for? And he said, well, there's got to be an ignition. Something has to set it off, and that's got to be an electrical source. So we were looking for a battery. It had to have a means of completing the circuit, so there was probably a micro switch. What's a micro switch? Well, it's the thing that when you open your fridge door, the light goes on. He said there will be a detonator. He had various detonators that he pulled apart and showed us what was in detonators. There was a box. Okay, what sort of box? Well, it was probably a wooden box, so we're looking for wood. So with any scene, you always start at the outside and work in. So we started the scene search in the neighbours' places. Pieces of human tissue were found on the roofs of neighbours' houses, had gone right out through the windows, and up in the gutters they started finding little pieces of wood, particle board. It was painted black.
In what was left of the kitchen, more fragments of black particle board were found. Could this be pieces of the bomb casing? Conditions inside were overwhelming.
It stunk. It was rotten. There was blood and maggots and flies everywhere, and it wasn't very nice at all. So we gave them masks and rubber gloves, and we gave them sieves and various degrees of sieves, and they would cut a square inch, a cubic inch of blood matter and mess off the floor, and they would put it through these sieves and wash it and sieve it through and see what came out of it. The lounge was relatively unscathed, and in it they found this large yellow envelope. When the scientists had a look at it, inside they found some microscopic, like pinhead sizes, pieces of black, little black crumbly bits. And they looked at it and they said, well, we think that's paint. Anyone, whether it be a post office employee who actually received the parcel for posting, or anyone that recognises the writing on it or has seen the parcel before, if they could contact their nearest police station, it would be much appreciated. The envelope went off to fingerprint section in Wellington, and they looked at it and they said, we've got some prints on it. And we said, beautiful, wonderful.
Detectives were now confident they were dealing with a parcel bomb. In any homicide, the body is the key exhibit, and the post-mortem on Michelle Stikovich revealed a pivotal clue.
In her chest, we found an electrical connector, a bayonet connector, which turned out to be a German brand, Grote & Hartmann. And we did some inquiries and we found out that the only known source of those coming to New Zealand was on the wire that goes from the distributor to the coil on a 1955 Volkswagen. So then it was a matter of making all the links. We knew that her husband was in Kaitaia, and he was an obvious suspect right from the start. It was, people don't get blown up for nothing. There had to be a reason. And talking to the family, yes, it was estranged. There was a relationship there that had gone bad, and he had taken the children away, so we thought, right, great.
The detectives searched the husband's house for anything that could link him to the bombing. Black paint, micro switches, perhaps a Volkswagen.
They found that he had built a dune buggy, and underneath his house they found the remains of where he'd stripped the motor out of this thing, and the piece of wire from the coil to the distributor was missing. So we'd found a source for these Grote & Hartmann terminals. So we'd connected the scene in Rotorua with the offender's scene in Kaitaia.
But the Volkswagen motor alone wouldn't be enough evidence. Detectives pressed on.
We found where he'd rigged his own bell system using a micro switch on the door, so that when someone opened the door, the bell went off and let him know that that's what it was. So he had expertise in using micro switches, we knew that. And they saw a swirl of black paint where someone had tested a spray bomb. And they got a saw and they cut that piece of wood out that had the paint on it. They were later able to say that the paint they found in the garage at Kaitaia was indistinguishable from the little black flecks of paint in the post office bag and on the pieces of particle board that we'd found in the neighbours' roofs, in the house, all around the place. So we had that connection again.
After 4 weeks of meticulous investigation amassing nearly 2,000 pieces of evidence, the detectives could make an arrest. David Stikovich was charged with murder.
We were a day before trial, pre-trial arguments starting, and we got a phone call from his solicitor to say, could we present the indictment the next day? And I said, pardon, why? Because we're pleading guilty. And he said, they looked at what we had, they couldn't fault what we did with the exhibits, they couldn't fault the scene examination, they couldn't pick holes in that, they couldn't fault the credibility of the scientists in the work they'd done, they couldn't get over the fingerprints. And he said, really, we had nowhere to go. We didn't have a defence. I spoke to him after he pleaded guilty, and we sat down in my office for a couple of hours. And I said, how did your prints get on it? And he said, every time I handled that bag, I wore gloves. I said, what about when you bought it?
15 cents, thank you.
And he looked, he said, oh my God, you're right.
Cases like the Rotorua parcel bomb proved that the tiniest details can come together to catch a murderer. Pieced together, even the smallest clues could provide a virtual roadmap to the guilty party.
The crook involved had cut himself in the assault, and we followed a trail of blood away from the scene, and it went for about a good couple of miles away from the scene where the blood splatters were across the road, and then along the footpath, and he turned right and went down an alleyway, and as he went through the alleyway there was blood on the bars, and you could see that at one stage the blood was getting further apart, which means he was running quicker. Some of it was getting thicker, which means he was bleeding more profusely, and we eventually lost the blood trail in a particular area in Mangere, and so it was there that I decided to throw all our resource at a door-knocking phase that we call an area canvas, and our crook was in that area, and he was living in a garage, pretty much where the blood trail went cold.
Sometimes the clues will lead you right to the conclusion. But sometimes it takes a bit of digging to uncover the detail of what really happened at a crime scene. Knowing the importance of paying attention to every detail, one young detective's keen eyes proved the undoing of a killer. Police were alerted when an elderly woman failed to meet up with friends. Detectives became suspicious when they investigated her husband, SPCA campaigner Alf Benning.
They'd found that he had been withdrawing money in the last few weeks from her post office savings bank account. And so they whistled him away in relation to that, and in the hope of trying to break him down in relation to where his wife really was. And so we obtained a search warrant for the house, and so that was my first real major scene as such. We knocked on the door, and here is this lady who turned out to be a lady of the night. She was servicing Alf from time to time, and then when he was fast asleep in bed in another room, she was in bringing her clients into the house and conducting her own business.
Detectives searching the house noticed a small amount of blood in a crack in the laundry lino.
We peeled back the vinyl floor covering, and blood had seeped through the crack and soaked into the floorboards underneath. So we became aware that obviously Mrs. Benning had probably met her end in the laundry.
But they still had no idea where she was. The search moved into the backyard.
Alfred was a meticulous gardener, but there was a new apple tree that had been planted, and one of my very keen young observant detectives realised that the grass had been turfed quite a distance away from the wee square of earth that was surrounding this new tree.
Could the recent planting hide something more sinister?
We came across the top of what appeared to be a newspaper parcel, and we peeled the emerging piece of paper away and realised that it was obviously flesh and hair and other bits and pieces. And we then started exhuming the body, and it had been wrapped up in several parcels. Head had been severed, arms, legs chopped off the body and wrapped in separate newspaper parcels, stacked on top of each other in a very large hole with an apple tree planted on top.
Alf Benning was convicted of murder and later died in prison. Detectives had painstakingly combed the Bennings' entire house and garden for clues. But when a crime occurs on public property, containing the scene can be a challenge. As detectives discovered when a body was found lying in the middle of a busy road.
It was a cold, windy Wellington morning, and this homicide scene was about 300 metres long from the top of Brown Street, down Brown Street, round the corner in Adelaide Road and down to the corner of Girton Terrace.
Quinn recalls this homicide well, as it coincided with another major clash in our nation's history, the 1981 Springbok Tour.
An inspector came to see us and said, "You're going to have to clear the rest of Adelaide Road, get off here, because thousands of demonstrators are going to march to demonstrate against the tour outside Athletic Park, which is directly up Adelaide Road from the crime scene." And I simply said to him, "No, they will not be coming through the crime scene, and we will stand and protect our crime scene to the death." And the demonstration came around into Adelaide Road about 150 metres away from where we were. And the marshals, very responsible folk they clearly were, because they understood, they'd heard on the radio that there'd been a homicide and that there's an investigation going on. And they corralled their entire demonstration over onto the footpath, and they marched about 2 or 3 wide down the footpath, a great big snake of a demonstration, past our crime scene, and didn't disturb us at all.
The dead man was well known to police, none other than local mob president Lester Epps from the gang pad just around the corner. There was more to this murder than met the eye.
Brown Street itself was just awash with glass. We divided up the street into 10 areas, and we searched each area and we picked up all the glass that was in there, and that was named glass from area 1. We then seized the exhibits from the next area, looked for anything obvious. There was Epps's blood and other body tissue lying in the middle of the road, and then just swept the place spotlessly clean, and eventually we had Brown Street as clean as it had ever been in its entire history.
At the bottom of Brown Street was an old ambulance. The mongrel mob's van crashed into a lamppost. Lester Epps had been keeping watch in the van that night before he was attacked. The windows were smashed and there was blood, weapons and clothing fibres throughout the wreckage.
This was clearly good evidence, because if we can find an offender whose jersey matches the fibre in the broken window of the ambulance, this is fairly good evidence that he was there at the time that Epps was being attacked inside the ambulance.
Back at the station, detectives sifted through the fragments of glass, matching evidence from the van to evidence from the street, building a picture of what had happened on Brown Street that night.
The investigation uncovered that the Eastern Suburbs Rugby League club, who drank in the Tramway Hotel, were in constant tension with the mongrel mob that also drank in the same pub.
The mongrel mob had apparently dealt to one of the league players' cars that was outside the Tramway Hotel. So the league players decided to get their own back and mount a bit of a campaign against the mongrel mob.
Before dawn on Saturday morning, the team met up at the hotel car park with weapons, determined to exact a bit of street justice.
Get him, boys.
We think probably between 20 and 30 of them were on Epps in the van before he was aware that anyone was around.
After mongrel mob president Lester Epps was left for dead in the middle of a main road, detectives were faced with reconstructing the violent events, piece by tiny piece. The 25-year-old had been asleep in the mob van when he was attacked.
He's let the handbrake off and tried to steer the ambulance down the road. And the very last lamppost in the street, it hits it, and so it can't go any further. So he's been chased down the street by his attackers. The attack on Epps in the intersection of Adelaide Road and Girton Terrace was horrendous. The injuries were incredible and they were never survivable.
Evidence began to mount up.
The investigators who were looking for the suspects, they were going out there and seizing jerseys and jeans and shoes, coming back, and in the soles of the shoes were broken glass, and we were able to later on, with scientific assistance, say that broken glass came from that part of the roadway. That jersey had those fibres in the broken window in that van. Some of the weapons had been just implement handles and such like, and we found one that had a broken end on it, very sharp broken end, and then when we did a crime scene examination where they had gathered, I found another piece of wood that matched that implement handle from the Brown Street homicide scene. And then later on, a detective doing a crime search of a suspect's house came in with the third part of the same handle. So he was struggling to explain why that part of a handle in his bedroom, part at the gathering point, part of it inside the homicide, it sort of like put him right in the box seat.
There was no escaping the evidence from this thorough scene examination, and 11 members of the league club were convicted of manslaughter and sent to prison for 18 months. The tools and technologies a detective can call upon are constantly evolving. But what's available today is a far cry from the way it was back in the day.
There were very few patrol cars. There were no radios. You had to have 2 pennies in your pocket to make a phone call back to Central in case of an emergency, and a clean handkerchief that was freshly ironed to kill the germs in case you came across an injured person in the street and had to tend their wounds.
It was a common sight to see a detective leaving the station with his personal typewriter on the carrier of the bike.
You had a bus pass which allowed you on the buses and on the trains free of charge as long as you could produce it. If you happened to be making an arrest, it wasn't unusual to bring the prisoner back on the bus with you.
The arrival of computer systems in the 1970s was revolutionary. Detectives could now access national records almost instantly.
The Wanganui computer system in its contract for the police said that when you do a query on a person or a car, you will get a response from the computer within 17 seconds. And so we stood in front of these computers in 1976 and you put in a car registration number and 15 seconds later the answer would come back. We couldn't believe how fast it was. It was just lightning speed. Now imagine a detective in 2010 waiting for 15 seconds. He would pick the computer up and throw it out the window.
The first time a computer was used in a serious crime investigation in New Zealand was to catalogue the 2,000-odd exhibits when the Rainbow Warrior was bombed in 1985. The international spotlight was on the detectives and on a couple claiming to be innocent Swiss tourists visiting New Zealand.
Sophie Turange and Alan Turange, they were the names that they gave at that time.
Everything indicated that these people were not who they said they were.
She was very pasty-faced, meek, mild, tearful, painfully thin, and certainly not good looking.
He was a very arrogant man. They were both obviously under huge stress. You can imagine, it wasn't supposed to play out like that.
The couple had stayed nearby.
We found that they'd slept in different rooms, which I found unusual for a married couple. We searched the rubbish bins in the room and found a Tampax wrapper in French.
Pieces of the puzzle flooded in from the public all over the Upper North Island. French sailors in Whangarei, inflatable dinghies abandoned at night, an outboard motor dumped in the harbour. Detectives suspected the two Swiss tourists were in fact French agents, and they now had to dot every I and cross every T to ensure a watertight case and a conviction. A detective needed to travel to Europe to build the all-important chain of evidence, and Kushla Watson became the first New Zealand woman detective to be sent overseas on an inquiry.
It was decided that we needed to prove that these were false Swiss passports, and in order to prove that, Superintendent Alan Galbraith asked me to go to Switzerland to do the inquiries.
After establishing the couple were not Swiss, Kushla travelled to France.
Because we had located the tampon wrapper with French writing on it in the motel unit that we knew they'd stayed at, I needed to try and tie that in some small way, not totally, but by shopping in France where we believe they came from and buying the same item. It's just another little piece in the chain, if you like, to show that that item would have been purchased by her in France.
It's critical to build a complete picture to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The outboard motor and dinghy were tracked to a boating shop on the outskirts of London.
Spent a lot of days at Barnet Marine talking with the staff there about this French man who had arrived to purchase the items. And then I tracked the taxi driver who picked up the Frenchman and loaded his taxi up with a big package, which was a Zodiac dinghy and a motor, and tracked the hotel that he took him to and interviewed the staff at the hotel and showed them a montage of photographs to see if they could pinpoint the man.
The staff recognised one man, Gerald Andreas, alias Eric Audronc, one of the French yachties seen in Whangarei.
Just all the little bits of the puzzle.
After more than 4 months of investigating and preparation for the trial of the two French agents, a late guilty plea meant the court case was over in just moments. The agents spent just 8 months of their 10-year jail sentence in New Zealand before diplomatic pressure led to them being moved to a Pacific island.
From the police department, can you open the door, please?
Terry Batchelor was given the task of escorting the couple back to Howe Atoll.
We're flying on this military plane, and I actually asked her a question. I said to her, one question I said that's been burning in my mind all along: why did you bother to return the van at Newman's Rentals? Why did you not just drive to the airport, throw the keys to Avis or or anyone of a number of rental agencies and just, or not throw it to anyone, just leave the van abandoned. Why? And she said to me, oh, you would have blocked the airport. And I said, but we didn't even know who we were looking for. She said, you would not have blocked the airport? I said, no. And I think that it was the first time that she actually realised the tragic mistake they'd made. Because had they gone straight to the airport, hopped on a plane like Air France, I think they were booked on, they were flying away, no one would ever stop them.
Evidence gathered in the interview room could be particularly compelling for a jury. And for detectives, it was always satisfying to get the cough, a confession or statement, especially when it was caught on camera.
There was always allegations being made by defence counsel that how come this person had confessed, how come they made a written statement. It was obviously done under duress, under force.
When video interviewing first came in, and we were sort of a bit sceptical about it, and the defence lawyers were the ones that are pushing it.
As it turned out, many of the offenders were just delighted to see themselves on a little TV screen. I recall instances where an armed robbery, where the offender had a shotgun and attacked the dairy owner in his home, take the takings from the dairy.
And how did you break into the place? Well, I dived through the window and shoot, okay. Grabbed my bag, not my gun. The window was here, yeah? Give me the money!
And stood up and explained how he did a forward roll with a loaded shotgun through the window and explained in great detail how he managed to get in without having this thing go off.
Video interviewing was a great innovation in that you were able to capture a person on camera as they were at the time, and the juries, it's good when they get to see that. They'll see someone with slick back hair and a fresh suit sitting in court, and then see them on the night at the interview abusing the interviewers and talking disparagingly about the victims and trivialising what they've done.
After a period of time, defence counsel would always advise against video interview, and so the reason why they wanted it was because of impropriety by the police. But when they realised that these people really did make confessions, and they were frank and open confessions, that their advice then was don't go on video, because it's once you've been on a video, that's the end of it.
Video technology was proving its worth, not only as a means of recording interviews, but for secret witness testimony too. The job of the detective doesn't stop at the arrest. They must gather all the evidence and build a detailed case for the offender's conviction. Often the best evidence is testimony from an eyewitness, witnesses who are hard to find on gang turf.
Whenever a mongrel mob gang member comes to Taranaki, something major happens.
Detective Senior Sergeant Grant Coward was called after a violent attack in a cul-de-sac in New Plymouth. When the Stubbings brothers visited town, they made the mistake of wearing mob colours.
The Black Power found out they were there, so they attacked the vehicle that they were in and attacked Gary and his brother. And they used a slasher and an axe, and there were 3 of them.
Police knew they were up against it. This was Black Power country, and while there must have been witnesses to the vicious attack, neighbours were too scared to talk. No one had seen anything, until detectives knocked on Christopher Crean's door.
It was me that knocked on his door, and he was a family man, 2 or 3 kids, and was a Christian.
So you heard the banging, and can you remember what time that was?
It was roughly about 1:30. It was about 1:30, wasn't it, love?
Yeah.
And was going about his business as he normally does, but looked out his window and saw what was going on. He identified the 3 offenders. And the 3 offenders were arrested and charged with grievous bodily harm and remanded in custody for a bit, but then released on bail.
Detectives had the witness they needed to stand the case up in court. With the gang members on bail, they offered Crean witness protection, which he refused.
I'm not afraid of these guys, and I'm willing to do this for my community and my family.
At the time of depositions hearing, he was required to give evidence. He stood in that witness box and pointed them out. 1, 2, 3. He clearly identified them as being responsible for the grievous bodily harm on the Stubbings.
The offenders knew that Crean's testimony would put them away for a long time, and they weren't going to stand for it. The same men who'd attacked the brothers weeks earlier returned to the cul-de-sac and Crean's house. Christopher Crean died in hospital, and now the gang was under fire.
The Black Power were rounded up, obviously. There was a few of them. The Black Power president decided to give Queen's evidence if he was given immunity from prosecution, which is rare.
To avoid going to prison with his mates, the Black Power president gave evidence against his own via video testimony from a secret location. Chris Crean could no longer stand in court and give evidence on the attack he'd witnessed. But those attackers would not walk free. Convicted of murder, they were sent to prison for life.
If I look back on my career, I could put my hand on my heart and say, thanks very much, Christopher Crean. You did New Plymouth a favour, because once those 4 guys were convicted of murder, the serious crime level decreased dramatically. And, you could personally thank Christopher Crean for that.
Courtroom testimony relied on a witness's memory of events. Those memories can fade with time and become unreliable. But by the late 80s, new technology was being trialled that would revolutionise crime fighting. DNA testing ushered in a whole new level of microscopic detail for investigators, and forensic scientist Sue Vintner was at the forefront.
DNA testing has got to the point now where it's extremely sensitive. We're able to get DNA profiles from only a few cells. So remember, we recall back to the first DNA test needed a bloodstain the size of a 50-cent piece. Well, now we can DNA profile samples that are invisible.
An investigation in 1992 was one of the first tests of the new technology.
A woman jogger had gone to the toilets in Grantham Street, just below the police station, and when she went in, the place was covered in wall-to-wall blood. So she rushed out and contacted the police.
The dead woman was English tourist Marjorie Hopegood.
Marjorie came to New Zealand to trace her roots. She was born in Auckland in 1959, but was adopted by an English family when she was just a baby. She'd been back just 7 days when she was killed.
Detectives began their detailed scene work. Fingerprints were sent to be checked against the national collection. The toilet block was covered in blood, and samples had to be taken and tested.
All the blood samples we took were the victims, except for this one little sample that was on the basin.
Whose blood was it? DNA testing provided a profile that could be compared against that of a suspect, but detectives needed a suspect. A long list of possible suspects was created with the help of people living near the crime scene.
Do you recall seeing anybody unusual in this area?
Well, we see lots of unusual people in this area.
A lot of people had seen the offender, and so we had identikit pictures of him, so we'd put them all around town. And as a result of the identikit pictures going out, people were dobbing in their mates and neighbours left, right and centre. We had over 300 names given to us. Every name that came in, we went and sucked blood from them.
I'm going to ask you if you agree to give me a specimen of your blood. You haven't got any objections to that? No.
Hundreds of blood samples were taken and DNA profiles extracted from everyone. As the testing dragged on, police continued to pound the pavement.
One of the policemen putting the posters up just happened to walk past a chap in the street and he thought, oh, he looks a bit like the offender, so he just took his name and put it in the pile.
Went out and had a preliminary talk to the guy,
and he does look very much like this picture as close as I can see from the picture. And he won't give blood.
At first request, he refused blood, which is always a bit of a clue that something's a bit strange. So on the inquiry, I had an attractive young detective who was working, young lady detective, so I sent her out and she came back with the blood, no problem.
It was the matching of that blood, plus a footprint and a palm print, that led police to Pico.
And in very short order, he admitted doing it.
The killing of young women, particularly foreign visitors, is always a shock to the nation, and it's no easier to stomach when you're a detective. Family man Colin Lyons headed the inquiry into the killing of another English tourist, Monica Cantwell, on Mount Maunganui in 1989.
There was this tourist who'd come to New Zealand to backpack around the country and was murdered and raped. At the same time, I had a daughter, same age, back in Europe. So the effect on me was horrendous, really. Because at the time I was doing this investigation, she had arranged to ring me at a certain date and time, and she didn't keep that appointment. So I had a lot of sleepless nights. And when you're dealing with crime, particularly against young people, and you've got family of the same age, I mean, you put yourself in the same situation as the victim's family. Really, it's not easy to deal with, really.
That strong sense of empathy means detectives will work tirelessly to get justice for a victim, even years after the case has gone cold.
If you go into a scene, you're going to leave some DNA there. You're going to shed some skin. You're going to breathe on something, and there's going to be some minute DNA left behind.
The new science of DNA testing might have seemed a godsend for detectives, but in its infancy, scientists needed large samples. When Arrowtown woman Morin McKinnell was found dead at Christmas 1987, Brian Hewitt was sent to investigate. The investigation would thoroughly test his tenacity.
Her body had been lying in the open for 5 days, so it was quite, she's quite decomposed.
Whoever had dumped her body from the bridge had missed the Arrow River by a few metres.
I pointed an OC body, which we always do, a person that's an officer in charge of the body. The first thing she did, and which we normally do, is put a bag over the hands and the feet and the head so that we don't lose evidence whilst we're moving it.
If Maureen had scratched her attacker and there was enough blood, skin or hair under her nails, the DNA could lead them to her killer.
Maureen had quite long fingernails, like long, attractive fingernails, which she kept very immaculate. And so, as part of the post-mortem process, that they were cut and bagged. Also, they were scraped. So you had scrapings plus the fingernails.
The evidence was sent to forensics, but while there were tiny traces of blood in the sample, there was too little for DNA profiling. The inquiry continued. Rails were taken from the bridge over the river. Maureen's car and house where the killing took place were examined, but the killer remained elusive.
We would have spoken to thousands of people and probably had about 600 people we put under close scrutiny.
It seems everyone you meet in the Lake District has a theory on who killed Morin McKinnell and why. The local paper has fuelled the speculation.
Yes, we've heard that a large number of rumours, but no truth in them whatsoever.
A couple in particular we put under real close scrutiny, to the degree that I had teams working on these two people, and these teams said that was the man who did it. Now, I knew that both of them hadn't done it, therefore both the teams couldn't be right, therefore both of them could be wrong. And so I kept looking for any other potential suspects.
But after months of interviewing and investigating, the inquiry was at a stalemate, and staff were needed elsewhere. Nagging in the back of Hewitt's mind was the fingernail sample he'd taken from the body. Could it provide the missing piece of the puzzle? Hewitt was soon the only detective still working on the case. For 15 long years he waited, the McKinnell file always within view for DNA profiling to improve enough to crack the case. In 2002, he decided it was time to look at it again.
We identified about 10 exhibits to look at, and number one priority was the fingernails. And so it was sent to Sue Vintner in Auckland.
The cellular material was recovered from the underside of the nails, and we undertook the DNA profiling tests.
They're able to get very small parts of DNA, then multiply it to that enough to make an identification.
We loaded that profile onto the New Zealand DNA databank, but there was no hits.
Had Hewitt's patience been for nothing? It seemed Maureen's killer may never be caught. The DNA databank had come up short. Hewitt broke the bad news to Maureen's mother, but she was supportive as always.
I'd go and see her around Christmas time quite often and just say good day to her. Lovely lady. And she always says to me, Brian, you'll solve it one day. And she had more confidence in me than I had in myself.
Her confidence was not misplaced. The following year, there was a breakthrough.
I got a phone call from a colleague who works on the DNA databank to say that they had had a hit.
I'm at a meeting, like a district meeting, and I get this phone call from Sue Vintner. Identify the DNA as Jared Mangles.
That he was very pleased, yes.
30-year-old Jared Mangles had been arrested in Nelson for disorderly behaviour. When the arresting officer routinely asked if he would add his DNA sample to the national database, inexplicably, Mangles agreed.
Jared, to me, seemed an ideal candidate. And the larger our DNA databank, the more resolved crime we're going to have.
He was the 79th suspect Hewitt had interviewed in Arrowtown in 1987.
He was 15 years old at the time, and he lived in Arrowtown, not far away from where Morin was murdered. He was nominated as a suspect because he did burglaries of batches within the Arrowtown area. And I suppose in those days, we didn't think a 15-year-old would commit that type of crime. I suppose in later years, yes, there was a number of 15-year-olds committing some serious crime.
How do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Guilty. When he pleaded guilty, he spoke to Maureen's two sisters and apologised, and they asked him why. He said, I don't remember. So he didn't say why he did it, and that still bugs me.
Mangles was sentenced to life in prison, and all because Hewitt had hung on to those precious fingernail samples.
In many other cases, around that time, where there were no leads, there were no suspects, it was common practice just to return what they could to the families and destroy other exhibits. So in this particular case, I was just amazed that he had the forethought to put those samples away just in case testing came to light, 10 years, 20 years' time, that would give them the answer that they were seeking.
I knew that she wouldn't lay down and die, that she'd fight. She would have fought for her life, yeah. And that was the case, because she scratched him, and that convicted him. So Morin was responsible for convicting the person that killed her.
Next week, the eyes and ears of the public help detectives catch a killer.
She said that is the vehicle that your hitchhiker got into.
The big guns are out on both sides in the war on drugs.
5 or 6 firearms loaded in the house, so it's a dangerous business.
And the block of cheese that caught the conspiring kidnappers.
I had a guy who was my needle in the haystack detective, and that was his sole task. Tell me who the victim's going to be.